Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video. I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by the one and only Rob Ison. Hi Rob.
Hi, James.
So I've invited Rob for a very special chat on an album that we're both very fond of. So we're going to be looking at Queen Sheer Heart Attack, and I've got my CD here. I know Rob's got his vinyl copy. You've been chasing down your serial numbers, I believe, Rob, trying to establish whether you've got some kind of rare first pressing, have you?
Unfortunately, not. No.
Right.
I bought the album new in 1983.
Okay.
But I didn't actually appreciate until I started digging that the original copies were actually laminated. So
Yes.
being that this definitely isn't laminated, it was quite obvious right from the outset that it wasn't a
Okay.
first pressing. So there you go. Yeah, yeah.
And was it your first Queen album or an early one?
No, I had the greatest hits was my first Queen album, which was obviously a couple of years earlier.
Yeah.
But I knew the album because obviously my brother had it from '74 when it was new. I bought it from a record shop called Focus Records. It's been closed for many years now, and I can remember buying it and riding it home. And I had it, those remember those panniers with kind of the spring-loaded things that used
Mm.
to, and I could sort of put the record on the back, and I was gingerly letting the spring go down because I was so worried it was going to just twang and just bust the record. But yeah, I just lived and breathed the album for
Yeah.
years and years, and I've just never got sick of it. It's just
Mm.
it always delights whenever I
Mm.
put it on.
I used to flick through Queen albums all the time in record shops, but this one always used to appeal to me, just that shot. I always used to wonder why is Roger Taylor upside down on the cover?
Yeah.
And it turns out that it's hair, he's got hair extensions. Did you know that?
Yeah, apparently so. Yeah, I was really surprised when I read about that. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
so the photo was arrived at. Mick Rock, the photographer, had them lie on the ground. It was Freddie's idea. He wanted them to look like castaways on a desert island.
mm,
So Mick Rock made them lie on the ground and he hosed them down with a hose pipe. And then he
mm.
stood on a step ladder and photographed them from the top of the step ladder. And then for some reason, Roger's hair wasn't impressive enough. So Mick Rock went in afterwards and artificially grafted hair extensions on to make it look a bit more, like a Timotei advert or
Yeah.
something. I don't know.
Because it
But
just looks like his ordinary hair. It doesn't look like artificial at all, does it? I do remember that when my brother used to listen to music, because the stereo was in the front room and the
mm,
curtains were always closed, whatever time of day it was, summer or whatever. So ne'er any light ever came through the windows. So it was really dark and sort of atmospheric. So all you ever saw was the kind of the lights of the VUs. But in the twilight, I remember looking at the cover, but for some reason, the eyes, because of the darkness of it, and of course, you've got this very stark red
mm,
against the black, and the eyes just seem so piercing,
mm.
and just quite unnerving. Sort of when you're a sort of 6-year-old kid looking at that, and these kind of the look on their faces. Yeah, I
Yeah.
found it quite arresting.
I was always
Yeah.
quite taken by the knife slashes on the back cover,
Mm.
which wasn't completely original because the Genesis album Trespass had that, didn't it? It had a knife
The knife, of course. Yeah.
slashing through the back cover.
Mm.
It was definitely one of the top three Queen albums that I loved most of all. And
Mm.
I guess as we get into the tracks, we can kind of talk about that a little bit. So let's just
Sure.
do a little bit of history, shall we? Because I've just got some very, very basic history here. So it was recorded in the summer of '74.
Mm.
And it was their third album, obviously. It was done in three different studios, Wessex Air Studios and Trident as well.
Hmm.
And it came off the back of a pretty tumultuous set of events, really. They'd done this tour of the US supporting Mott the Hoople,
Mm.
and Brian May had been diagnosed with hepatitis following a dodgy
Injection, I think,
injection.
isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so he'd collapsed in the hotel, been hospitalized. The tour was basically cancelled. They flew home. Brian was in hospital, and Freddie, John, and Roger went and started recording. And they laid down quite a few tracks in Brian's absence. And then Brian
Mm.
came back to the studio and then promptly collapsed again with a duodenal ulcer. So they must have thought, I think Brian at the time really thought his number was up because
Is
it,
that,
you know,
yeah, you would, yeah.
so many ailments. I mean, he wrote the song Dear Friends, which is on side two, from his
Mm,
hospital bed, you know, and I think it was
mm,
almost a coded message to his bandmates, like, you know, please don't throw me out of the band. And then Brian came back finally and, you know, recovered, and then he was able to lay down his guitar tracks. But
mm,
I think that's interesting history with Queen because it's the only album where that happened. You know, all the other
mm,
albums, I mean, Queen albums were notoriously difficult to put together because the band members used to squabble and bicker with each other dreadfully.
mm,
It was so dreadful that Brian May said it genuinely used to affect his mental health. It used to drive him nuts because all four of them were control freaks, essentially, you know.
mm,
But all the other albums, you can say, you know, all four of them were basically just there working on it together. Whereas this one, three of them recorded most of it, and then Brian came in and laid his stuff down, apart from one track, which we'll talk about.
mm,
So, what do you make of that? I mean, when I listen to the album now, maybe I can hear some of that coming through. I don't know. The album seems to have this very spontaneous feel to it. There's
mm,
something different about the tracks. If you compare it to Queen 2, which seems
mm,
really, really well considered and really coherent, like a sort of
mm,
solid body of work, isn't it? Especially side two, where Sheer Heart Attack, it's like a gadfly. It just shoots around at tangents and sort of, you know, goes off in this direction, goes off in that direction. And I'm wondering whether that had something to do with the way it was kind of pieced together in this strange way where they didn't have the guitarist there and it was all just, oh
mm.
shit, let's just try and record some stuff and see what we come up with. Do you get anything like that from listening to the record?
I think so, yeah. And I mean, there's always, I always thought, particularly with the side two, it's just because the helter-skelter way
Mm.
that the songs are very short, very succinct, and they all kind of, there's barely a breath between the tracks, and there
Yeah.
really seems a sense of urgency there, definitely. I think, yeah, I mean, I seem to remember reading about Brian May saying how astonished that he was that they'd managed to do so much work
Mm.
in his absence, you know, whilst he was away for all this time. And, you know, because especially like being the guitarist of the band, you're a kind of essential
Yeah.
part of the cog in the wheel in the machinery, you know, and you not being there. But I just think it just shows the tenacity and resolve of the band just to be just to have that focus and work ethic and creativity in his absence. It's just phenomenal, you know. And perhaps, as you say, because that's the only time that it happened,
Mm.
sort of in the history of their recording, that's maybe why the album's got such a special feel.
So what Brian said when he came back, though, quite interesting. I think for him, it was the album which finally, well, actually, I think for all of them, I think for different reasons, but for Brian, I think the album was the first time he properly clicked into the idea that they were doing something special because he said he
Mm,
walked into the sessions and they'd already done all this work. So he was able to hear it with fresh ears, where the previous two albums,
mm,
obviously he was there from the ground up, you know, right from the start. This album, he
mm,
came in, he heard all this music and he was kind of like, wow, you know, I'm in this band. This band is really shit hot.
mm,
And he kind of heard it with fresh ears, really.
yeah,
And it was the album famously which John Deacon finally decided he was going to ditch his, I think he was still working on his electronics BSc,
yeah,
and I think all of them, in fact, I think Brian was still
mm,
doing some teaching. Essentially, when this album came out, they all just laid down tools, really. And
mm,
it wasn't their first hit album. I mean, Queen 2 had got to number, I think it got to number 5 in the UK charts.
mm,
Seven Seas of Ride being a big hit single, and they were already
mm,
doing Top of the Pops and touring, and you know, touring with Mott the Hoople in the States. But it was only
mm.
when this album, they'd done this album, I think, that they'd sort of listened back to it and thought to themselves, right, this is clearly working. You know, it's
We're
clearly
heading in
getting.
the right direction. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Although Brian though didn't like the only song he didn't like when he came back in was Killer Queen. When he heard it, he thought it was too lightweight. He certainly didn't want it as a single, and he wasn't happy with what they'd done. He made them totally redo all the vocal arrangements for it. So that was an example of a song where he definitely thought, no, no, this has gone off on the wrong track. And I think
mm,
he was genuinely stunned when the single was a massive hit, obviously.
mm,
And he composed the song Now I'm Here at the last minute because he thought that there was too much whimsy on the record, I suppose.
right. To
So he
bring it
thought that,
back on track into the rock era, yeah, kind of, yeah, get
yeah,
it rocking, yeah.
and have you noticed that Queen 2, that Sheer Heart Attack, if you listen to it in sequence with the first two albums, it's the first Queen album where they get a little bit jazzy in a way.
Mm,
They start to experiment, they start to move out of the prog art rock, heavy rock
Mm,
thing, and they start to experiment with these other things,
mm.
bringing out ukuleles and just experimenting with
Yeah.
more jazzy flavors, I suppose you might call it, which
But
was
would you also argue as well and say that that was part and parcel because of Brian May's departure for so long during the sessions? That maybe had he been there from the outset, that that Freddie wouldn't have got his way with all the kind of the jazzy stuff and everything, and
it's an interesting theory. The only thing about that though is in the
yeah,
next album, on Night at the Opera, you've got Brian May doing Good Company.
yeah,
So,
actually, yeah,
but
that's true.
maybe he'd
Yeah,
thought to himself, actually, that stuff on Sheer Heart Attack did actually work out quite well. Maybe we should
yeah.
go more, more in that vaudeville direction. So I guess what we should do maybe is move on to the tracks and just go through. We don't need to spend ages on each one, but if we go through them and just see what we think and see how it
Okay.
all adds up or not, as the case may be. The start of Brighton Rock starts with sound effects of a fairground,
Mm.
and it's courtesy of an Electra LP. Actually, it was Authentic Sound Effects Volume 1, and it was the
Okay.
it was the effects of a fairground, and it starts out with this lovely fairground music, doesn't it?
Yeah. Was there not? Because I always find it ironic that Queen 2 ends with Seven Seas of Rye with them singing kind of, "Oh, I do like to be beside the seaside." Now, on that clip, you can hear a guy whistling clearly, um, "I do love to be beside the seaside." So it's almost like it's kind of this Queen 2 ends and then Sheer Heart Attack almost like it's a continuation of where it kind of left off.
That's a great insight, Rob. I can't quite believe I've never actually put two
Yeah,
and two
yeah,
together
yeah.
with
I
that.
mean, it took me a long, long time before I actually realized that. And then I thought, that must be deliberate. That
Yeah,
must be deliberate. It's too much of a coincidence for them not to have done that, you know,
yeah,
deliberate, because it kind of works. It's especially in
yeah,
the sort of, the fact that Brighton's a seaside resort and everything, and you think
yeah.
of the pier and everything, and yeah, so
I mean, it works perfectly in the context of the song because the song
yeah,
is two verses sung in this extraordinary style by Freddie, adopting two different voices. He's doing the falsetto voice of this girl, and then then he's doing a lower registered voice for the boy. It's a song about two young lovers. It's lovers tryst among the
yeah.
penny arcades of Brighton, and they're having a bit of a sort of ding dong, and it's all sung or it's all written in slightly old-fashioned language, slightly sort of Victorian. He sings something
Mm.
like "Tarry with me,
With me,
pray," doesn't
pray.
he?
Nothing air may come between us. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah. So,
Brian had done that before. He was fond of doing that. He'd done it on the song White Queen on Queen 2, where he sings
mm,
or he writes in this slightly Elizabethan style,
Old English
Old
style. Yeah.
English. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you've got this weird juxtaposition because you've got this kind of old-timey thing, and then Brian uses it as this launch pad for all his Hendrix inspired,
Mm.
Rory Gallagher inspired guitar madness. Do you think it's overindulgent or do you think it actually works?
Well, it's really odd actually, because I remember when I used to listen to it on tape, my brother's tape, and I never actually heard the whole song all the way through. So because he actually used the tape to do a demo down of, he was jamming out a song, and he obviously just pressed the record. So when it ends at the first verse, then it goes in. So I miss out all the "Oh Rock of Ages," the refrain. So when I bought the album and heard that, I was like, "Wow, what the hell's that?" Because I'd
Hmm,
never heard
fascinating.
the refrain part of the song before. And this was like, wow, it's like, and I love, that's actually my favorite part of the song. I love that refrain.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I wish that it had been repeated. But, when I listen to it and the solo, and it's so obviously, and you can hear the fact that they're using the natural reverb of the studio,
Hmm.
because it does sound very, very live. So it was obvious that, Brian May was going to want to expand on it and use it so much in a live environment. But yeah, I mean, I suppose if you were going to be really, really picky, you could say that it outstays its welcome. But his guitar playing is just,
Hmm.
it's so visceral, and just, he's just, it's such great. playing, you can forgive it. It's just
Mm.
it's great. You know.
Something about Brian's playing on this album, which I don't think you hear on any other Queen album quite the same, is this kind of wild, raw quality. I mean, Brian
Mm,
has done raw guitars before and since, but on this
mm,
record, and maybe it was because of the way he'd been ill and come back into the band and all this
mm.
stress. Can you hear that? There's a kind of like there's a sort of hunger in the guitar playing, which
There's a
maybe is
real urgency and almost an aggression there that's kind of, and
yeah.
yeah, frustration, because he's probably like, it must have irked him no end. I mean, he was obviously probably scared, worried for his health. He was out of the band was struggling. They had the management problems, of course, and he was probably thinking, my God, is this is going to end before it's really got going. So of
Mm,
course it was almost like when he was unleashed back into the studio, yeah, for sure,
yeah.
he was hungry for it. And I think that's what's so great about and why it works so well as an album, because there is just an urgency with all the recording on
Yeah,
every
yeah.
on every song, really.
Okay, well then we move on to Killer Queen, which of course is the big hit off the record, and this is the one that
Mm,
Brian hadn't liked. It was a number two hit.
mm,
I mean, we don't need to talk too much about this one. I mean, who does not know Killer Queen? I mean, it's one of the most sort of immaculate conceptions, in a way. It's a sort of piece of confectionery, isn't it? Freddie said it was just a bit of fun, but it's so well recorded and so well arranged. All those velvety harmonies, and it just drips with expertise. Or
it's a classy pop song, isn't it? It's just utter. For me, it just oozes class.
it does, yeah.
I remember it's the first thing I heard. I remember I obviously, well, I can actually recall hearing it. I was on a narrowboat holiday, and I can remember it coming on the radio. And just because I was into Jerry Anderson and sci-fi, I've always loved that kind of stuff. And then hearing that line, gunpowder, gelatine, dynamite with a laser beam, I'd never heard
Mm.
lyrics like that. And that just, wow, I found that very, very exciting to hear a kind of line with a lyric like that in a song, when you're so young, because obviously I would have been, what, 6 years old at the time, but that always resonated with me. And yeah, I've always had a soft spot for Killer Queen. It's a fabulous song.
So
Wonderful.
then we move into this section of the record, which essentially it kind of goes into this little mini symphony or a kind of Abbey Road type thing. You've got Tenement
Mm,
Funster by Roger, segueing into Flick of the Wrist by
mm,
Freddie, and then out into Lily of the Valley by Freddie. And
mm,
the songs are all linked together, but there's nothing similar about any of them. They're quite different songs, aren't they? But they
mm,
do seem to flow into each other. So Tenement Funster, this is the Roger track. Interesting
mm,
song because he'd been brought up in middle class comfort in Truro. He was a dental student. There was no way that he was a tower block dwelling working class adolescent, but he was,
mm,
I don't know, he just had the balls to go, right, I'm going to sing a song about this playboy tower block dwelling adolescent who's just basically, wearing his blue suede shoes and going out to clubs, and he's really popular with the girls, and his mother wants him to cut his hair,
yeah,
and the song ends with him sort of driving off in this big,
yeah,
noisy car. I mean, it's Brian doing the
yeah.
car engine with his guitar. But what do
Rock
you
and
make of
Roll
this?
Rebellion. Yeah,
Absolutely. I mean, he was
yeah,
laying down. I mean, he'd done it already on Queen 2. He'd done Loser in the End, and on the first
yeah,
album, he had the song Rock and Roll on the first album too.
yeah.
So Roger seemed to be cutting his cloth quite early on. He was like, well, regardless of what Freddie's doing, regardless of what Brian's doing, I'm going to be the guy in the band that writes these cocky rock and roll type songs where I'm going to maybe send myself up a little bit. I don't know what you think about that. Almost, let's just do a sort of two-dimensional portrayal of this teddy boy character.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, for me, I just think it's my favorite Roger Taylor song. I think he's really it's a great song. It's a little bit more considered than the two that you just mentioned from the previous two albums. I think
Mm,
it yeah, it was more accomplished. It's very Abbey Road, the D, the major to the major sevenths minor. It's very those kind of changes are so Beatlesque.
yeah.
And yeah, it's that's maybe one of the reasons why I like it so much, because I love Abbey Road, and you can hear,
Mm,
there's at least a passing resemblance
mm.
to the feel of the guitar on that record there. I think certainly, yeah.
It's almost like a kind of Pete Townsend, Tommy
Mm.
world that he creates.
Yeah.
And then I love the kind of segue, the clever segue, because Tenement Funster essentially is about this guy who's pretending to be a rock and roll star, but he's not really. And then
Mm.
it goes into Flick of the Wrist, which is this very angry Freddie song, which was written really about the business troubles they were having at the time.
Dislocate your spine if you don't sign. He says, I'll have you seeing double. You know,
That's right. Yeah.
pretty intense kind of stuff, isn't it?
I think it is quite clever to go from Tenement Funster, where it's he's imagining this glorious future as a rock star, and then Flick of the Wrist is written from the perspective of somebody who now is a rock star and is
Mm.
not, he doesn't feel like he's getting his due.
His
And
Jews, yeah.
it's a really angry song. And Brian May does this great, he does loads of really great sort of chromatic, Tony Iommi style, coiled guitar, really sort of
Mm.
angry.
Yeah.
Sorts of nails what Queen did best, that kind of combination of heavy and then just going out into a very poppy, upbeat thing. Quite
Mm. And they
interesting
do these
combination.
very intricate harmonies at the background as well in the back. It's which I mean, obviously the album is just littered with fantastic harmonies, but
Mm,
yeah, it's probably for me on is the thing that struck me the most was the vocal harmonies. I think just so
mm.
didn't sound like anybody else
So
really.
then the final part of this little medley mini symphony is Lily of the Valley, which is a
Mm.
very mysterious, beautiful Freddie song. It's mainly just him on the piano, isn't it, I think? And this is one that Brian May later, he said that he'd interpreted it this way anyway, because Freddie never discussed any of his song lyrics or meanings or
Mm.
anything like that. But Brian said he always understood this song to be a kind of veiled attempt by Freddie to come to terms with his sexuality, because he hadn't come out as gay. In fact, he never did. I mean, this song, when I was a kid listening to this song, obviously I would never have picked up anything like that. I mean, the song, to me, it sounds like a throwback slightly to the stuff he was doing on Queen 2. On
Mm.
side 2 of Queen 2, he gets into all these very kind of fantastical songs, which I think,
Mm.
I think a lot of them were influenced maybe by his background coming from Zanzibar. He came from the Persian faith and he had all these stories, I think, from his youth, all the kind of myths and fables. And this
Mm.
song, I think, is like that, isn't it? It's very much a mysterious fairy story type song.
I just think it's just beautifully played and sung. It's just elegiac. It just flows beautifully. I love the way that it builds up, to the crescendo and
Hmm.
stuff, but it doesn't seem over the top.
No.
It just works. It just everything about it. It's like a lot of the songs on Sheer Heart Attack. It doesn't outstay its welcome. It's short. It's
Hmm.
very well considered. The construction of it's great, and it just perfectly. It just works great.
But I mean, then the side ends with Now I'm Here, which is this very rocky, raunchy kind of song. The first time maybe that they'd tried something
Mm,
this raunchy, I suppose, because Queen music had never really been raunchy as such. I mean,
mm.
I think it was probably influenced by Mott the Hoople. Certainly the words were a direct reference to some of the shenanigans that had gone on on the Mott the Hoople American tour down in the
City, just the Hoople and me.
yeah,
Yeah,
but then he also mentions Peaches, doesn't he? Down in the city, just Peaches and
yeah.
me. And Peaches was this girl that he'd had a bit of a fling with in New Orleans when the band were on tour down in New Orleans. He'd had this very intense fling with a girl who he later tried to track down. He was really smitten with
It's
her.
just massive, isn't it? It's
Mm,
just the whole sound is just so huge. It's almost like I can imagine it maybe because I remember reading about Martin Birch recording in rock, Deep Purple,
right.
and saying that they were just trying to, it was so dynamic that the needles were almost bending in the
Mm,
studio. They were trying to get so much power and energy. And you almost get that feel where it's almost at the point of overloading.
mm.
The guitars, it's so heavy and dense, but it's just brilliant. The energy on it is just fabulous.
Side two, we probably need to speed up a little bit. I mean,
Okay,
there's a lot to take in with side two. So
yeah,
let's just go at this hammer and tongs and just say, well, I'll start by saying I've always found side two to be a bit of a strange side. It starts out with Lap of the Gods Part One by Freddie, which to me sounds like the start of this immense concept album, which then doesn't materialize. It sounds like he's trying to set something up.
mm,
I mean, it's incredibly well done. I mean, you've got all these high Roger Taylor vocals and kind of this atmosphere. I think, again, it goes back to the Queen 2 thing, doesn't it? It's sort of
yeah.
fantastical sounding.
When you first played that track, because there's a very very short lead in
Mm,
before Roger Taylor's operatic mad banshee vocal comes in. And I remember the first time I played it, I had the volume turned up and it scared the shit out of me.
Yeah,
It, literally, because I wasn't expecting it. This is, oh, it's like, what the hell? Where's that come from?
yeah,
And it's a bizarre track, isn't it? And then this
yeah.
kind of like Rachmaninoff style kind of,
Mm.
piano coming in, and it's very fluid, and these guitars underneath and these massive vocals. I mean, it just sounds like so
Mm.
Olympian.
It's Freddie at his most creative, at his most visionary, I suppose, but doesn't quite fulfill because it just sort of comes to a stop and it goes into Stone Cold Crazy, which is this very almost like sort of proto thrash metal thing. It
Yeah,
was a
yeah,
song
yeah.
which they'd had, it was one of the oldest songs in their catalogue. Freddie had been playing the song right back to his days in the band Ibex and
Mm,
Wreckage, which were the two bands he had before Queen. So I think this was probably them in the studio thinking, shit, we've got to find some material. Well, let's just finally record Stone Cold Crazy because we've had it in our set all this time. We haven't
mm.
recorded it.
Stone Cold Crazy, just like, God, it's relentless. I mean, it's almost like when you're listening to that, you're almost like out of breath at the end of it, aren't you? Because
Mm,
it's just so energetic, so much crammed into it. And all these songs are only about 2.5 minutes. They're all really short
yeah.
songs, but the quality of the musicianship that's
Mm.
in these little snapshot of songs is just phenomenal.
That's a great
And
phrase, snapshot songs. That really, really sums up what they're doing, I think. If you take a track like March of the Black Queen,
mm,
there's so much going on, but it's all
mm,
going on at once. So
yeah,
what they decided to do with Sheer Heart Attack is have the same number of ideas, but rather than having them all at once, having them in
mm,
this kind of scattershot thing where it's just like
scattershot.
one after another,
Yeah,
just really like fast and quick.
mm,
And I suppose in a way, it turned it into a kind of microcosm of what Queen were going to be for the next few years, which is
mm.
essentially this really diverse band where you didn't ever quite know what song was going to come next.
And you can see why it was the beginning of their kind of moving into a sensibility that was far more pop
Yeah,
orientated.
I mean, after Stone Cold Crazy, which is this, I suppose you call it a proto thrash thing, really. I know it was big,
Uh,
it was influential on bands later on, wasn't it?
a lot
Metallica
of speed metal bands and stuff.
played it,
Yeah,
speed metal. Yeah, although Roger didn't
yeah,
play double bass drums on it, as far as I know. He managed to do it with only one bass drum, which is
yeah. Right.
extraordinary. But then you hit this really quick fire thing. Then you got Dear Friends, which is just a very brief little piano ballad sung by Brian. It was a song that
Mm,
he wrote in hospital. Straight into Misfire, which is John Deacon's first song for the band, which is very short and sweet. And then straight into Bring Back That Leroy Brown, which is one of Freddie's camp vaudeville style songs. So the whole of the sort of middle of the side,
mm.
where you think there might have been this grand concept, this lap of the gods thing. In fact, it's not
It's
that
all
at
over the
all.
place, isn't it? It really is. It's just a mess, really. But it
Yeah,
works. It's so cool because you
yeah,
don't know what's coming next. You treat it to sort of mythological grandiosity, then speed metal, then into just like vaudeville and
mm,
1920s 30s jazz or whatever. It's like, what, how many other albums deliver with that other than, say, something, I don't know, the White Album? You could argue, I mean, maybe that was
good
a
point.
sensibility there, perhaps, with that eclecticism. And
Yeah.
you know I mean, the thing is, there's such fantastic musicians that they could
Mm.
just, I think there was just a sense that we can do whatever we want.
John Deacon's first song, Misfire, I think is a nice little song. I think he was going to go on to do better, but I think it showed that he had his own sound and his own style. This very sort of risque lyric, don't you misfire, fill me up with a desire to carry on. It's
Mm,
so funny because John was this almost invisible kind of mouse-like guy in the band. He never spoke, he never
mm.
sang. He was known as Easy Deacon because he was so quiet and easy to get along with. And yet he
Unassuming, yeah.
and yet he writes this song with a
Mm.
very, I suppose you could describe it as saucy, kind of saucy lyric.
And it's got those kind of almost like Caribbean style drums in the background as well, hasn't it? It is a weird mix, but
Yeah,
lovely riff with the acoustic at the start. And
yeah,
I've always loved it because it doesn't outstay its welcome. It's really neat. I mean, it could have been a single,
yeah,
I think. It's really is. It's very commercial, and the way it modulates and it kind of goes up,
yeah.
really, for a first effort. I mean,
Yeah.
fantastic, really. You
I
know,
mean, then it goes into She Makes Me, Stormtroopers in Stilettos, which I think Brian wrote this one when he was in hospital as well. It's almost like a sort of folk song, really, but they do it in this sort of Phil Spector-y kind of way, this very booming, reverberant kind of sound with these very
love it.
slow, plodding
Yeah,
drums and
yeah.
wonderful chords.
I
And
absolutely love this song. This is probably arguably on some days it's my favorite song on the album.
mm,
I love it, and I love the chords. The chords in it are lovely, very, very Beatlesy kind of the way that it's structured and it moves, or that's how I interpret it anyway. With the reverb and the Spectre-esque kind of feel of it, it
yeah,
definitely gives it a kind of dreamlike kind of quality,
yeah.
which is really sucks you in and
Mm.
carries you along with it. You know.
And then the album finishes with Lap of the Gods Part Two, which is a piano ballad, and it's one of these ones. It's in 6/8 time. It's like We Are the Champions. So it's got that kind of feel to it.
Mm,
And the song builds in intensity. So at the end, you've got Brian and Roger and Freddie overdubbing themselves into this huge choir, essentially. But it's this really
mm.
dark, vengeful kind of sound, very operatic.
It's my favorite on the album and my favorite Queen song. It's so easy, but I can't do it. So risky, but I got a chance. It's so funny. There's nothing to laugh about. It's almost like he's having a kind of conversation with himself, and it's full of contradictions. But it's
Mm,
almost like a kind of, it's like a metaphor for life almost. It really is. It's just, I really think on some levels that lyric is really quite profound. And I mean, I'd almost have it at the funeral. I really would. It's
mm.
like I've thought about it. I mean, people often say this, don't they? You know, or what song would you have played at your funeral or whatever? And I don't tend to like to go there because it's a bit maudlin, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
But I would, you know, that would be a contender
Mm.
definitely for me.
Yeah, I think
Um,
I think what was interesting about Freddie's writing at this period, and maybe that's what you're mentioning here, this idea of the lyrics being metaphorical. It seems like there's always something more to what he's trying to say, and that I think that was something which was going to really manifest in Bohemian Rhapsody massively the following year. This idea that there's
mm,
something more to these stories or these monologues that he's writing. I think it's something which maybe Queen detractors, people who don't like Queen, maybe that's the thing that they don't hear or perceive. They just kind of hear this guy who's maybe just stitching these words or these phrases together to try and be clever or to try and be a bit theatrical. But I think at this point in his life, he hadn't really come out even to himself, I think. And he
no,
was clearly a very intense guy who was going through a hell of a turmoil, probably. And because he had this great genius, whatever it is, like a musical genius, a lyrical genius, he was finding ways to write about what he was going through that was so heavily coded that nobody really would be able to work it out. But it was still, the power of it was still evident.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I really, really do get that sense of profundity. You know, I mean, that sounds pretentious, doesn't it? Almost, but it's like it. He really does the way he sings it, and the lyric is so poignant. You know, it really is, and it's. Um, I just think it's one of the most affecting things he ever wrote. I mean, you know, for me, it just eclipses like "Love of My Life" or something like that. It's just a magnificent album, I think,
Hmm.
and I think it's just the energy, verve, creativity of a band that was on the cusp of becoming huge,
Hmm.
but was just almost, in my opinion, at the peak of their writing creativity. You know,
Hmm.
I think.
That was fantastic, Rob. Thanks very much for that. What
You're welcome.
an in-depth discussion that was. It was really enjoyable, and obviously, it's an album which means a lot to us both. So, thank you very much for joining me for that one.
Definitely. No problem at all.
So,
Really enjoyed it.
good stuff. Okay, folks. Well, don't forget to check out Rob's channel. I shall link in the description below, and let us know your thoughts on Sheer Heart Attack. What you think of it? Is it Queen's greatest album? Is it one of Queen's best albums, or not, as the case may be? Let us know what you think. So yeah, we shall take our leave and say bye for now.